Thank you very much. Right, so welcome to the Virtual-Agile Meetup. It's really lovely to have you guys here today, so thank you very much for coming and for spending this time. I know that our time is very precious, and as we always say, it's just lovely that you've come to hear us today. So and hear our wonderful guest. I worked out that it was our 21st session of these talks and these meetups. So 21 is like a big birthday sometimes, isn't it, in people's lives? So hooray! Not 21 years yet. Will we get to that? I don't know. There's only so much Agile we can take. No, hopefully we will get to that. Anyway, moving on. So you may know by now, I'm Helen Garcia. I'm an Agile coach, a professional coach, sort of helping organizations with agility. And I have my wonderful co-host, Ines Garcia, who is sometimes known as the Swiss Army knife. Ines, would you like to add anything more than that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. Yeah, Agile coach, Swiss Army knife, climate coach, circular economy professional. Just, throw it at me. We'll sort something together.
Yeah, she just loves lots of different subjects by the sounds of it. So that's really good. Thank you, Ines, as well. So just to give you a bit of an overview of this evening. So the hands up is basically if you have a question at any stage, our wonderful speaker, Frances, is happy for you to come off mute, just wail away. I mean, don't wail, that can be quite off-putting, but do say your question. If you feel a bit shy about it, then whack it in the chat. Ines or I will pick that up and we can always ask it on your behalf. What else? Like as you know, we're recording the session, so we do like to upload these onto YouTube, only so we can share our knowledge. That's the whole point and the whole reason that the Virtual Agile kind of came about. Time box wise, we do have, now I always mess this up, but I think it's how long have we got? An hour and 22 minutes left. If we don't take the whole session, that's totally fine. If you need to drop halfway through, that's totally fine. Just let us know. But yeah, we'll have Frances who will be speaking for around about probably 45 minutes, something like that. So that's good. And like I said, with the chat, if you've got anything that you want to share that pops up into your mind, and you think, oh, this is really interesting, I'm sure other people would find this interesting, then put it in the chat as well. Please utilize it as much as possible. I know faces in here, so you're not shy to speak or chat amongst yourselves. So go for it. What else have we got? Yeah, the famous rock, paper, scissors. Who knows the game rock, paper, scissors? That's right, we've got scissors, paper and rock, Amanda. So that was a little bit confusing, but I really love this game. As you know, play it every single time. I also play it with teams quite a lot. It's a really good decision-making tool and just to get some feedback. And I keep saying it's universal, but I learned the other day that actually it's not universal. Not everybody knows this game. So what we'll do is a bit of a practice round. And what I'm going to ask is the twist of rock, paper, scissors is a question. And then you guys are going to respond, and you can put it in the chat as well if you're not comfortable being on camera with yes, stroke, I agree, depending on the question. So you're going to show me a rock. All those who are able to show me rocks, could you do that right now? Bit of a proof of concept. Yeah, okay, great, lovely, wonderful. Courtney, are you on a stepper or a walker? What's happening? It's quite...
Yes, it's a treadmill desk.
Brilliant, this is really cool. It's the first treadmill desk we've had here. So anyway, thank you.
Highly recommend.
Yeah, good. Okay. I could just do it and just pretend I am, which I don't know why we don't do that actually, just kind of move. Anyway, moving on. And then it's going to ask you another question and you're going to show me a paper, maybe. Any papers out there? Okay, cool, lovely, beautiful, floaty papers, love it. And then lastly, scissors, depending on if you had a good day or a bad day. Yeah, excellent, good. Cool. Okay, right, so are you ready to rumble with some of the questions then? You know I love a bit of audience participation. The roaring screams, excellent, cool. Okay, so first of all, the question is, I hear scaling and I run a mile. We practice, guys. We practice with the rock. So, okay, cool. Should we try it again? Let's try it again. I
should come on camera for this, shouldn't I, really?
Yeah, totally. That'd be great. I hear scaling and I run a mile. Oh, okay, we've got some papers. Okay, great. Next question. Okay, my organization is currently going through a scaling of Scrum, Agile, less, I don't know. Okay, we've got some papers and scissors out there. So we don't know if they are, we think they are, maybe not. Cool. And lastly then, scaling Scrum is fine, but scaled Scrum is not a thing. What does that even mean? I don't know. Right. So I think, Frances, I've set you up really well. That's all I can say. There's a lot of confusion maybe out there. There's a lot of interest on the subject, which is really good. I want to just come on to this quote here. Right and wrong cease to be useful concepts when you're talking about, and I've just bracketed it, software development. The reason I've chosen this quote today is firstly really around the idea of what is right and wrong. You know, when I'm coaching or when we're with teams, I always talk about, we talk about what's right and what's wrong. And actually, if we can pivot and think what's helpful and what's unhelpful, and address that with when we're looking at our Scrum teams and when we're thinking about, is if we make this bigger, if we expand it, if this triples across lots of different teams, is that going to be helpful? Rather than what's the right thing to do? Because is there ever a right thing to do when it comes to, agility and becoming more agile? I think is an important question. And perhaps there is in your view, but perhaps there isn't. So today we have got the wonderful Frances Hosking, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to her because Frances and I worked together recently on basically scaling Scrum pretty much and working in the same team. Frances is the head of delivery at the Economist, and she is a fantastic leader. Why do I say that? Because she is fair, she is fun, and she welcomes loads of different voices from all over the place. And that's really important when you're leading. Frances understands the importance of embracing like the values and principles and, understands that. And that's also such a valuable part of our day in, day out. Often we come into teams and actually they don't even know what the Agile values are. And I find that quite shocking. So it's really lovely to have a leader who actually gets it. So I just really want to kind of hand over to you, Frances. And I'm really excited that you've been able to join us today. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Helen. A lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to share this talk with you. I will get down to sharing my screen so I can start to run you through it. So hopefully you can all see it now.
Yeah, it's just coming through.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see that now, yeah.
Wonderful. All right, so I have called this talk To Scale or Not to Scale, Is That the Question? And I've framed it in this way because I found that from looking at scaling our Agile practices, we often focus on the process side of it. But some of the learnings that I had from doing it with our teams is that it made me reflect a lot more on the values and understanding the key objectives that sit behind it. And so I'll run through some of those points in my talk today, and we'll have a look at what are some of the key questions that are important to look at when scaling. So to give you a bit of an idea of our context and when we started to think about this, we had a new CEO who wanted to invest much more in our digital products with an aim to move to more of a digital first approach. So we'd been more of a print first approach previous to that. And she secured some funding from our board, and our teams grew from 9 to 18 as a result in 6 months. So we pretty much doubled in size. And prior to that, we'd been working on more of a team by team basis, and teams had been working more sort of in silos, focused on their product areas. But a lot of the work now was moving more towards being cross-team. And we weren't necessarily working in that joined up way. So we experienced some growing pains as a result of that. So the results are depicted here. So we had lots of teams that were overlapping in terms of what they were doing and really stepping on each other's toes or eggs in this image. So we'd spun up lots of different mission teams, but hadn't necessarily considered the interdependencies and the holistic picture in terms of what we were trying to achieve and how they'd work together. So this was causing a few different issues. Duplication of effort and communication. There were multiple handoffs. We were also seeing silos as well starting to appear. So our teams are fully cross-functional. And we were particularly seeing this around our design team. So they were sort of working on things in silo, and it was kind of getting chucked over to the engineering team. And that was causing quite a bit of rework and lag. There was a lack of clear ownership of the architecture. And then getting visibility just in terms of what was going on across the ecosystem was really difficult, just in terms of, what's going on in the different roadmaps, but also from a systemic impediments perspective. So there was no way to roll things up. So that was also the duplication in effort in terms of trying to solve things as well. So the growth in the number of teams just meant that we really needed to find some new aligned ways of working. And to just better align all of our activity around our business objectives and our customer value streams. So we started to think about, how do we fix this? So wanted to look at 4 key areas with the approach that we changed to. And this was to deduplicate effort, increase collaboration on shared objectives, reduce decision latency, and to empower our teams as well. And specifically to empower them to, I suppose, adjust and embrace change and be able to take a bit more ownership themselves for resolving impediments. So I started to look at a few different agile scaled frameworks, and I did some training in SAFe. So SAFe is more of a methodology than a framework, and as a result of that, it's quite prescriptive. So there's a lot of benefits to it, but I think culturally for the Economist, it wouldn't have worked so well. It also requires change throughout the whole entire organization, and the scope of this wasn't that. It was really focused on our digital teams, and there wasn't the appetite for an overarching agile transformation across the organization. I also considered LESS, so large-scale Scrum. Again, another really strong contender, but Scrum at scale is what we settled on. And just because it was a lot more pragmatic based on how the teams were already working. So it built on the Scrum practices that we already had in place. So the majority of our teams were working in Scrum. We had a couple of working in Kanban, but it was sort of Scrumban really. The governance model was much lighter compared to something like SAFe. And again, culturally, that would work much better. And it also being based on Scrum meant that it built on those key pillars of inspection, adaptation, transparency. And they were really important to us to help focus on empowering the teams and reducing decision latency, which were 2 of our key problem areas. So this is the Scrum at Scale framework, and it's the brainchild of Dr. Jeff Sutherland. And he created it based on just seeing the need for this out in the field more and more. So obviously it's very normal for a Scrum team to be working on one product, but in larger organizations, there's a need for them to work in a network increasingly. And what he'd seen was that when the number of Scrum teams grew, what tended to drop was the quality, volume, speed. And this was due to things like the cross-team dependencies being managed effectively, there being a lot of comms overhead and duplication of effort. So all sounded very familiar to us. He also found that the original management structures didn't tend to work so well to achieve business agility due to having a number of competing priorities and not potentially being able to shift quite easily around changing market conditions. So maybe priorities in the organization, maybe economic, political, whatever it may be. And essentially this change is inevitable. And I think we're seeing that pace increase more and more. So he wanted to create a framework that addressed that. So it's a framework that just looks at effectively coordinating multiple Scrum teams, and it looks to achieve linear scalability and business agility. So by linear scalability, he's thinking around the number of teams that you increase it by should be the same as the customer value output in terms of what that's increased by as well. And then in terms of business agility, it's the ability to respond rapidly to change, and so be able to change the initial configuration, whatever that may be for your teams. So it's helping multiple Scrum teams to focus on prioritized goals. And it does this by setting up a structure which essentially just extends the way that a single Scrum team works. So you're kind of just scrumming the Scrum. And from the managerial function side, they look to set up a minimum viable bureaucracy. And they define a minimal viable bureaucracy as having the least amount of governing bodies and processes needed to carry out the functions of an organization without impeding the delivery of customer value. So it really is looking at how can we cut down bureaucracy and optimize the agile principle of embracing change with a much larger number of teams. So unlike basic Scrum, from what you'll see from this drawing, is that it doesn't just cover the Scrum Master cycle, so the how, but also the product management cycle, so the what and the why. So that this meant, as well as optimizing our processes for how we work, we also had to scale the product ways of working for defining and also prioritizing the what. And so we needed to get a lot of product buy-in for that. And a lot of the work that we did was also very much with the product team. So Scrum at Scale talks about how you can essentially start rolling out Scrum at Scale. And it suggests creating a reference model. So we decided to run a small experiment by creating our reference model. So a set of teams that will work in this way. And the prerequisites we were looking for those teams was a shared objective, minimal dependencies on other teams, and complete end-to-end product design and delivery accountability. And the idea is that we would test and learn with this reference model, and then use that to create our Economist scaled framework, and then roll that out further across the organization. So this is a drawing of how we applied it. So this is the Scrum at Scale base framework, which is what we started with. And we did this within our engagement domain with 3 teams. And the prerequisites were met for the most part, but not fully on the shared objective. So 2 of the teams really strongly shared an objective. And the third, I would say, shared it, but not to the same level. So if you look at the 3 teams within the dotted red line, there are our mission teams that are working in Scrum. And if you look on the right with the horizon, so their horizon is 0 to 1.5 months in terms of what they're focusing on. And they have all of the Scrum ceremonies that take place for them. So this team has the ability to use all of those ceremonies to resolve any impediments, etc., that come up. But if they're not able to, then they can escalate it to the team of teams level. So in Scrum at Scale, they actually call this the Scrum of Scrums, but we used slightly different language. So the team of team level is essentially another team that sits right across the domain. And within it, you've got a lead product manager, engineering lead, delivery lead, lead designer and a lead data analyst. And part of their role is to resolve any impediments that the teams aren't able to deal with themselves. But it's also to focus around refining out the pipeline of work. So this team, the team of team level, receives the work as folders. They break it down into rocks, and then they pass the rocks to the team to break that down into pebbles. And they're looking at aligning the work that happens right across all of the teams to the overarching objectives that exist within that domain. So if you look at their ceremonies, all of their ceremonies are essentially scaled versions of the Scrum ceremonies. So they're aligned with the Scrum values and pillars around inspection, adaptation, and transparency. And that's really the aim of all of them. So the team of team daily stand-up is to increase collaboration across the domain. The fortnightly scaled planning is to ensure all of the teams have the right focus for the sprint. So it's aligned with the overarching domain sprint goal and the objectives of the domain. The fortnightly scaled refinement is breaking down that work in the way I just described across all of the teams. The fortnightly retro is for inspection and adaptation across the domain. So it's really trying to encourage openness and the sharing of the learnings, but also to identify any patterns across the domain to address more holistically. And then the fortnightly sprint review is to give transparency into work that's going on across all of the teams to showcase how that has come together to achieve the overarching domain goals and objectives. So then linked to that, we've got the executive product team. And the executive product team has our C-level or senior leadership on it. And again, this team's there to resolve any escalations that can't be solved by the team of team. So the people that are part of that need to be empowered to be able to do that from a financial, political perspective. And it also really focuses on the what the teams are doing. So this is the route for teams to be able to find out if there have been any changes or anything. So we talked about before how the flexibility is baked into the Scrum at Scale framework. So this is the place where if there have been any changes, we can talk about that and understand if we need to look at how the teams are working, changes to roadmap, etc. And it also is a place where if there's any calls needed to be made in terms of risks, issues, dependencies, etc., this is the path that you can take to be able to do that. Then slightly to the side, you have got the executive action team. And this is completely related to these teams, but it doesn't necessarily roll up in the same way. So the executive action team is focused on the Agile ecosystem and how we can improve things. So how can we get things done faster? So within that, we do look at how we can remove impediments, but Scrum at Scale frames them as opportunities for improvements. So that's what then forms as part of the transformation backlog that this team focuses on. And it's meant to be made up of senior leadership and then also the Agile delivery team. So this is what we started with. And our experiment proposed that scaling would enable us to deliver more consistently at a sustainable pace by having an operating model that allowed us to use our time more effectively. So to stop duplicating effort for the teams, but also for the leadership team. So at that time, we were sort of dealing with everything point on point. There wasn't really that visibility. And then it was difficult to delegate solving some of the issues to the right people as well. So our 5 key areas of focus for scaling in the experiment were to embed and improve data-driven delivery practices to improve flow, to increase visibility of our work and the opportunity to collaborate towards meeting our shared objectives, to realign with the Scrum values and principles, so how those values translated into behaviours in the team, but also then the principles more widely, ranging across our ceremonies, our roles and responsibilities. So we'd worked in Scrum for quite a while, but a number of our practices had become a bit diluted, and they weren't particularly consistent across the teams. And one of the things that the Scrum at Scale guide says is, if you can't Scrum, then you can't scale. So essentially, if you haven't got the right practices in terms of Scrum, you're going to scale those bad practices, and that's going to cause issues right across your ecosystem. We also wanted to scale our product management practices and then simplify our governance model to increase our decision speed. So there were 4 key hypotheses we wanted to test. The first was that if we could identify the reference model set of teams to have that end-to-end accountability, then we'd be able to test our agile scaling approach, and that should create the right culture and ways of working to enable our teams to identify and resolve our system constraints quickly and effectively. So we were wanting this to work towards building out a culture that has the characteristics of the 5 values of Scrum. So commitment, courage, focus, openness, and respect. And these sort of practices were looking to drive that. The second was that if we can reset roles and responsibilities and values to align with Scrum, then this would enable us to work more effectively at scale. So this was about just getting the practices right before we scaled. The next one was around our product backlog. So our hypothesis was that if we could logically decompose the product backlog from our business goals to our mission KPIs down to outcomes for the teams and into their backlog, then we'd be able to pull an aggregate view of all of the backlog items. So all of the items that were going on in relation to each of the different business goals and KPIs, and also their dependencies. And this was something that was quite key from a transparency perspective for the teams, but also for leadership. And then the final one was that if we could build a workflow within Jira which maps the ways of working between product design and build, then we'd be able to gain transparency of our design process and improve team collaboration and flow. And this was essentially what we were... Oh, sorry, was there a question?
I don't think. I think it was just a off meeting, but it's maybe a good time to ask if anybody has questions actually whilst we take a pause. No? Okay. Sorry, Frances, go ahead.
There was some comments maybe in the chat or no, but as a Scrum Master from the role, did it change much what they had to do? Did they have to do more coordination or something like that? Did their life change much?
So I would say from a Scrum Master perspective, not necessarily. So how it changed when we were rolling out and implementing was they were key in terms of the training with the teams, us implementing our new processes, resetting around Scrum, things like that. The senior delivery lead role that was working at the team of team level, that was quite a different role. So they were still on one team, but their roles became a lot more around the coordination across the domain. So that was a change.
What were the kind of pushbacks? I mean, you mentioned, I think one of the 3 teams in Team of Teams was not 100% on board. And what were the kind of pushbacks that you received from that?
Yeah, I think it wasn't necessarily they weren't on board. So I think they were up for trying it. I think as the experiment went on, it became clearer that they weren't aligned to the shared objective, and I touch on it a little bit later as one of the learnings. And because of that, there wasn't the benefit from them, and it became a bit of an overhead. And that's then when the pushback started to happen for them. So they were quite open to trying the experiment, but it became clearer as we went throughout that actually maybe all of these practices aren't useful unless you have got a really strong objective that you're sharing to work towards. Yeah,
it needs to be a principle that effectively is being utilised throughout. Otherwise, there could be a chink in the chain, as they say.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
But that would seem fairly apparent, I would imagine. That would be be able to be anticipated, because if people feel like, and I'm not saying this is the case, but if people feel like things are being done to them, they don't have buy-in. Certainly, if they feel like they have ownership and control, then they'd have more buy-in. And I'm wondering whether that might have been an issue.
Yeah, I think that the buy-in took a bit of time anyway. So I think that there was not necessarily, because our Scrum practices had been a bit diluted, the understanding of why some of them were in place anyway was a bit confused. And so part of this was a bit of a mindset shift to try and help them to understand what the point of some of them were again, and to role model them in the right way to build trust, to see that there was meant to be an open feedback loop there. We were going to iterate based on feedback of what did and didn't work. And we wanted to hear that from them. And they were the key people to solve the problem, not us. So yeah, that was definitely part of it. And it took some time and some role modeling to change that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very common problem. You get teams utilizing Scrum, and then they kind of think that the processes and tools become everything. And actually, they are the least important, right? You could throw them all away and just have a conversation and solve your problem, because it's the people that solve problems. Process and tools don't all. Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
There is actually a couple of other questions in the chat. Shall I ask them? Yeah. Okay. So the first one is, what metrics did you collect on the team of teams level?
Yes. I have a slide about that slightly later. Can I come to that? Is that okay?
Yes, of course you can. Yeah, definitely. And then the second one is around, you may have covered this actually, but are the people in the team of teams also in the missions, or are they interdisciplinary team whose job is to coordinate the other work? Sorry, I'm not very good at reading that.
No, that's a fantastic question, because it wasn't all the same for all of the practices actually. So for delivery, we were on a team as well as coordinating across the domain in our role. The senior engineering managers were just looking across the domain. So were the lead product managers. They were just looking across the domain. For the data leads, they were on the teams as well as looking across the domains, because they had to do a lot less coordination. They were more working with us on analyzing the data and looking at, when we were looking at the hypotheses, looking at what were the right metrics to be measuring in relation to that. And then the lead designer was on a team as well as looking across the domain as well.
Great, thank you. I think it was for Tim, who I hope that answered some of your questions that you had. Great. All right.
Yes.
Lovely. Thanks, Frances.
Okay.
Can I just throw a couple of questions in?
Yeah.
So you talked earlier about having multiple handoffs and silos, etc., etc. Did any of what you did solve that problem?
It did. But what I would say was it did within a domain. So it did within engagement, but it didn't necessarily when we had cross-platform features to deliver. So something that was going across web and mobile, because mobile wasn't necessarily within this domain.
So I'm a little confused as to how you achieve that, because unless you start incorporating the other domains like DevOps, et cetera, into those teams, then it becomes impossible. But then if you could, why wouldn't you just do that on a team by team basis anyway? It seems as though you could have solved that anyway, possibly.
Well, the difficulty was that the structure was looking to have a number of different domains. So within mobile, we have, at the time we had 4 teams, is now 5. And their focus and their objectives were very different to the engagement domain. And so there was a want organizationally to continue to work in that way, because the engagement team had maybe one feature in a roadmap that they would need mobile on, whereas the rest of the mobile teams worked on very closely on their shared objectives at all time. So it's a really good point there, and it's one that we raised a lot throughout this, which is the organizational design aspect of it. Are you organizing on the basis of tech stack? Are you organizing on the basis of customer journey? Are you organizing on the basis of objectives? And that's one of my key learnings of it in terms of the why, is that it's you can start something and iterate and see what works, and it does start to show you those things and those issues, but you also need that vision and that thinking as well of where you're trying to get to at the same time. It can't happen on its own.
Okay. And then second question, do you mind just rolling back your slides to the one about your base framework, just so that I can ask in context?
Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry for monopolizing all the time.
No worries. No, that's not it. There we go.
So your so your middle one, your team of teams there, obviously has a lot of leads in there. Did you find, so the nice thing about leads is they've got lots of experience. The problem with leads is they all have a paradigmatically sort of the same way of looking at a problem. They've been in the game for so long, they get jaded. And a lot of what can happen sometimes is there are benefits in trying to introduce people who are newer, look at the world differently, all of that. Did you find, or do you think that there's any value in introducing not just leads, but non-leads into that middle structure there, so that they can look at the world, and users as well, so that they can look at the world and the problem domain from an entirely different perspective?
So that is what we would do, because depending on the work, the people within the different mission teams were experts in relation to that. So say we were doing our scale planning, that all of the relevant people would be working with them as a part of that. There's a representative from each of the teams in the daily stand-up. There's a representative in the sprint reviews. And then in the retros, our scrum masters or delivery leads, as we call them, would tend to be the representative for the team. But if they weren't able to join, someone else from the team would join to talk to the leads about that as well. So absolutely, yeah, they don't have enough of a view to be doing that on their own.
Yeah, it's also just the way that we think about things, right? So yeah, I won't get into too much of that. But yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
No worries. Where had we got to? Oh yeah, just the final hypothesis. So it was about looking at building our workflow in Jira to map the ways of working between product design and build, to just get transparency. So this wasn't just about a Jira workflow. This was about trying to essentially break down that silo between design and product and engineering, to get transparency, but also bring them much more closely into our ways of working and work much more as a cross-functional team, so that we would have better collaboration, but also not have some of those constraints that we'd seen coming up. So not create that lag from not having the engineering team involved early enough in defining what a solution looks like. So the successes and the challenges. So some of our successes in relation to the 5 key areas we wanted to focus on. So the first was embed and improve our data-driven delivery practices. So we agreed what those delivery metrics would look like and started to build out those KPIs to measure objectives and to be able to track that progress. So that was a first to be able to do across the domain. So previously we'd been quite good at always tracking our sort of delivery metrics within the team, but we'd always just looked at that very much on a team by team basis and discussing that with the team, exactly as you should do. But when we were bringing them together as a domain, we wanted to look at that wider across the domain for the teams to look at how they optimize flow, not just across their teams, but across their individual domain ecosystem as well. So this was really useful as a starting point. And we worked with the teams on that as well to look at what are some of the metrics that they were interested in tracking as well. And some really interesting ones came up actually. One was around length of service. So they really felt that they had a lot of new joiners and it was creating a lot of lag on the team. And they wanted that to be understood and sort of visualized across the domain more. So that was one that we didn't necessarily track, but it was a useful one to talk about at that point, and to highlight that that was having an impact on our flow and on our delivery. We also introduced buffers into the delivery process. So we wanted to build more resilience in by having a much longer lead time on the stories that were actually refined. So obviously it's best practice to have a number of sprints of refined user stories to be able to feed the team, as it were, but that was not a practice that we had in place, and that was one of the key things that was impeding flow. So this was something we worked on with our product team a lot as well. Increasing the visibility of our work and our opportunities to collaborate towards meeting shared objectives. So we were able to make our discovery work more visible. So we had one board and one ticket for the life cycle of a story. So this was much better in visibility, but we also just were involving our design team in all of our ceremonies. They understood the point of the ceremonies and why now. Before they hadn't, and didn't feel it was necessary for them to join. But they started to get a lot of value out of that as well. And then realigning with the Scrum values and principles. So we found that understanding the why helped them to be run a lot more effectively, but it also encouraged much more openness. So previously the teams before, when they were just working in single teams, just saw their team as who they needed to communicate with. But by putting them in the domain to start with, and then setting up this structure, they saw them as their extended team, and that helped with communication a huge amount. And then resetting the roles and responsibilities really helped with the deduplication of effort. So the stepping of toes had happened within that as well. So there had been a real lack of clarity of who was doing what, and that just helped to reset things. In terms of scaling our product management practices, we rebuilt the product backlog to have much more of a focus on being user-led rather than technical-led. And then we were able to visualize that backlog in relation to our business objectives, which gave much better clarity on purpose and priority. And we were also able to then start creating our first Jira Advanced roadmap. So this started to visualize our cross-team dependencies. And we could also start to see things like how much work was going on in relation to a particular objective, which is one of the questions that we had been asked by our leadership team. And the team found it really useful for catching those overlaps in initiatives much earlier on in the flow. In terms of simplifying our governance model, we found that this helped that a huge amount. So having just the clarity in the escalation path from the minimum viable bureaucracy ceremonies meant that we actually knew where we could go for different things, whereas before that was just completely unclear. And essentially that meant that our impediments just got resolved much more quickly. Some of the challenges, as I've touched on in the questions, was aligning with the Scrum values. So this did require a bit of a mindset shift, and the teams didn't really see the point at the start. They did feel like, what is this? Just another bunch of ceremonies. Why do we have to reset it to what Scrum says? Like, why can't we do it how we want to do it? And so we really needed to do some more training around that. We needed to role model it. They needed to start taking the ownership of that and seeing that it was something for their benefit rather than something that was enforced upon them. And that did take a bit of time. How the design and discovery process works isn't actually specified in Scrum at Scale at all. So this was a bit of a challenge in that we had to then work through that, and it took some time, but it was also a fantastic opportunity because it meant that we could just work with the design team on what are the problems that they're facing, what does this framework look like, how could we bring those things together? And we had something that was very tailored to them, but also they'd created. So we had a lot more buy-in in the end, when at the start they weren't keen to try it because they didn't feel that it considered design. And so we kind of changed the thinking around that. The other was around shared roles. So we had identified the team level, but we were missing a number of people. And so capacity and capabilities was a constraint here. We did use contractors in some of the roles to help with that to start with. But one of the areas where it was particularly challenging was technical leadership. So we had great technical leads within the team, but when we needed to think about end-to-end cross-platform features, we didn't necessarily have some of the capabilities to help us do that. And also we didn't necessarily have full end-to-end accountability due to how the rest of the organization and the rest of the domains were organized. So it's really the point that I touched upon in terms of when a feature was cross-platform. Within engagement, they were able to do everything in terms of web, but then us being able to do it on mobile, there'd be a delay in relation to that because they didn't have that within their domain necessarily. So this was some of the performance indicators that we started to look at. And Scrum at Scale suggests these as a start, essentially the questions anyway that you should be thinking about. And then we came up with the KPIs in relation to our context that would help to demonstrate these. So the first, value delivery. So are we prioritizing the features that will help us meet our business objectives? So a lot of these are actually our product metrics that we were looking at here rather than our in-team metrics. So customer engagement and retention KPIs. So for us, that's things like our churn rate, our article views, our page views, things like that. Customer feedback. So we get those from multiple different areas. And then our comparison with hypothesized results as well. Our productivity. So, there we go. Back. Are we improving our ability to deliver over time? So one of our key metrics here was lead times. And this was actually a change. So previously we had measured cycle time. So from ready to dev to done, but our change in measuring lead time was from the actual inception of an epic or a story and being able to measure that right through to done. So this was really useful because we could value stream map across the whole entire piece. And quite often where the delay isn't actually within the team. It's things like decisions and waiting for our stakeholders. So this allowed us to look right across the life cycle of that particular piece of work to be able to get that data to say, actually, this is where there was delay and waste, and to focus on the right things to improve flow rather than always just looking within the team, because that's only part of the story. We also looked at release frequency and then churn as well. So churn was when stories were assigned to a sprint after the team had basically finalized the sprint backlog. And quality was the next one that we looked at. So are we meeting our quality standards? So we looked at our defect escape rate, performance monitoring, time it takes to recover from an incident, and then sustainability in terms of are we working in a way that we can sustain in the long run. So we'd look at tech debt versus feature development. We'd also look at team health checks that we ran. And then we had a tool called Team Mood, which was essentially an app that you could check in on a daily basis to sort of register your mood. We also actually had a large number of other delivery metrics that we would look at sort of across the domain generally. Things like delivery against commitment, like work profiles in terms of what's the work that the teams were working on mostly. Was it product development? Was it bugs? Was it tech debt, etc.? But these were the ones that we sort of really focused on looking at to understand our domain health a bit more. Are there any questions around that before I move on? Because there was a question on it before. Oh, okay. Where's going? So some of the key learnings from doing this were around, oh, sorry, no, I've missed a slide. So so from running it, we found some things worked and some didn't work. And these are some of the key customizations that we made to the base Scrum at Scale framework. Now, the Scrum at Scale guide says, if you change things, you need to be aware that you will not get the level of benefit that we are outlining. That is definitely true. But what I would say is there still is a huge amount of benefit. And for our context, we needed to make some of these customizations. So I would say heed the warning, but with a pinch of salt. So you'll see that in our
on that a little bit. So
Yeah.
impediment review, if you can talk about it in terms of whether it's just talking about what impediments you guys saw and you want to talk about it to try and make sure it doesn't happen again, or whether it's actually solving impediments, or both.
Yeah, so no, absolutely. So again, really good question. So it's one of the things that I actually like the best about this. So we created a Jira impediments board, and essentially things only went to it if the team wasn't. So in your mission team, if you could resolve it yourself, you resolved it. If you rolled it up to your team of team and they could resolve it, then they resolved it. It only went into this impediments board if it was something that was bigger than your team of team that you couldn't resolve. And then when it was brought up in the meeting, the ticket needed to have enough detail for some action to be able to be taken, and then was assigned to the relevant person. So this worked really well in terms of, because we had a regular cadence to look at it. Every time the meeting came up on the Jira ticket, you're like, hello, is there any update on this? What's been happening there? And you'd get a bit of a flurry of activity of sorting it out. And it also helped to keep the pressure on our senior leadership, because they had a tendency for things to, just, go off in the distance. Oh yeah, no, I do remember you mentioned that, but it was there in black and white. And it was something that we could tangibly follow up on and say, what's been the progress since the last meeting? And so I wouldn't say it did speed things up for sure and get things resolved quicker, but there is definitely still room for improvement in terms of making that quicker. But with some of it, it's because it's with our leadership team. If there were things within our gift to just solve ourselves that had been rolled up, we found they got resolved quicker. And also we found that when one team had rolled it up, quite often another would pipe up and say, actually, we're having exactly the same problem. And we found out it was a bigger impediment than just within a domain.
Yeah, so for the same reason, I would suggest that any impediments that are dealt at a lower level get effervesced and talked about in your product sync meeting. Because them having awareness of those types of issues could help them obviously get rid of anything similar in the future. It might be systemic, it might be a training issue, or we need to hire new people, or we need something. So awareness data means you can make better decisions.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because the domains did have their individual impediments board, but we didn't necessarily pull everything in. But yeah, it's a really good call. Yeah,
it doesn't necessarily have to be everything. It could, your team of teams could potentially, or somebody from the product sync team could potentially just look through and cherry pick the ones that they believe that are relevant, just so you don't endlessly talk about stuff that maybe they wouldn't understand or is irrelevant.
Yeah.
There was also another question in the chat. Do you end up with an impediment backlog?
You do. But what they're meant to be framed as is then what's the opportunity to improve. So they then also become actions in terms of a backlog of what you actually do about them. We had also the transformation backlog, which was set up within Jira as well. So that's then another place, once we'd identified what to do about the impediment, that again, some of the actions would go to. And the nice thing about these boards as well is they were visible to absolutely everybody as well. So you could see what was going on in relation to those things.
Thank you. Hopefully that answered the question. I think that's it in the chat.
Now it's learning. So the aim of the experiment was to take Scrum at Scale as our basis and look at how we adapted it to work as an Economist scaled framework rather than sort of trying to make it fit. So as a result of that, it meant that we had to test and learn continuously along the way, which, you know, it's Scrum, that's expected. People that enjoy that loved it. People that do not like change very much really did not like it, and that was something that we needed to think about more when going into this, people's appetites for change and how to deal with those things differently, and the level of support that might need to be given on that basis. Some of the real positives were that there was the communication and collaboration improved like tenfold. It was so much better between the teams. But a large part of that was just bringing them together and helping them get visibility of each other's work and how that was related. The earlier visibility around discovery really helped with much better cross-functional collaboration and helped to break down that silo between design and engineering. And our data-driven delivery really helped with flow and forecasting. And that was something that we rolled out as a bit of a foundational block across all of our teams. And we've actually taken that a step further now, and we're starting to look at how we use Monte Carlo forecasting with the teams as well, just to really, you know, help people understand what the basis of our forecasting is on, and also just ease up the amount of time that we're asking engineers to put finger in the air guesstimates about. So that's working well. Realigning with the Scrum values helped a huge amount with scaling. So because these had been diluted over time, the teams were a bit mistrustful of them. And by revisiting them in light of this experiment, it made it much clearer that this is a framework that is about inspection and adaptation. And this is a basis, but you're responsible for looking at what works and doesn't. And you know, when you speak up and say that, we will look at that as a chance to learn and to improve. And we'll be coming to you to ask how we do that. We won't be prescribing how that's done. And so they were empowered to do that, and this helped to build their trust and then also their commitment to the process a lot more. But that wasn't something that happened overnight. But when it did, we saw a completely different level of adoption take place to when we started. And one of my proudest moments was actually when our design team that were in the engagement domain had got to probably like their third iteration on the Jira workflow, and they had been really reluctant about the whole process and the idea of us like sort of working more closely. And they not only came up with a bunch of new ideas how it could work better, they then presented it to the rest of the design team about how the rest of the design team could potentially adopt it, and then presented it to the rest of our digital teams as well. So they were just fully owning it, and it's something that they took forward on their own without any need of further coaching at all from us. So that was fantastic to see. However, I would say the one thing we must remember is the first rule of scaling is not that you mustn't talk about scaling, luckily, as in Fight Club, but it is don't scale unless you have to. So this worked very well when there was a shared objective to achieve. So business objective, customer journey, etc. It doesn't work so well when that shared objective in the why is not clear. So in the reference model, as I mentioned, 2 worked very well. 1 was an outlier. And on that basis, it actually became a bit of an overhead for that team and some additional work trying to get them to work as part of the model. We did scale this across all of our domains, but in each of our different domains, we did have to adapt slightly based on the shared objective principle. And one domain had 4 teams that really strongly shared an objective, and the level of benefit that they got was, you know, way higher than the rest of the domains on that basis. The one thing that did work consistently well across all of the teams was the alignment with Scrum values and then the behaviors associated with them. So these practices within Scrum are there to essentially shore up those 3 pillars around inspection, adaptation, transparency. And by that taking place more, we saw better collaboration, better communication. So the teams were just working much better together. The processes were working better, and then that improves flow. But that was more around that than scaling. So back to the first rule of scaling, there are benefits regardless, but to maximize them, there does have to be that shared objective. Otherwise, it can become more of a management module than really achieving the objective of empowering teams to put customer value at the forefront, I would say. Any other questions?
I'm sorry, because I am on my mobile, as you can see, I'm struggling to see the chat at the same time. So if you could be bold enough, or somebody ask any questions that are in the chat, if you have any, that'd be great.
It's like a kettle. If you don't look after things, they just scale up. I love that.
Well, I mean, it's so interesting to hear from your perspective as well, Frances, like the challenges and the successes, but also the learnings, because you've had so many learnings. And it's pretty clear that scaling is not easy. Anything you scale, it doesn't really matter whether it's Scrum, whatever we do in life, when we make it bigger, it's really hard. And I suppose the key thing is, if we don't recognize those areas where we've gone maybe a bit wayward or a bit different, and we don't change them, then it becomes very rocky. But there's a lot of we've had a lot of feedback. And Mike, you've talked about some things that have been helpful, which is great, because we can all learn from it, right? Which is the important thing. So thank you.
I do have a couple of questions, but I'd rather have somebody else go first. No, okay.
What's that? Yep, I was going to say, go
on. So actually, my first question is for Courtney. I'm wondering how many miles she's actually done while we've been doing all of this. That's been fantastic. I feel energized just by watching.
I think I have like 6,000 steps right now, so it's really not that impressive.
Fantastic. So Frances, thank you very much for all of that. Very interesting. I've got loads of questions, but I want to throw a different paradigm your way and just see what you think. You talked about, what was it, boulders, rocks, and pebbles, or boulders, stones, and pebbles, in terms of your breakdown analogy, which I like. Thank you. That was great. I'm going to steal it, by the way. So it would appear to me that you could do a lot of what you did using Kanban and actually take a boulder and say, right, this is the piece of, so if boulders articulate the real value that a customer is going to sort of consume, assuming it's not bigger than that, then it would be the perfect size to be able to go, right, we want to try and deliver this next. Who do we need? We need these 3 teams from web, this team from mobile, infrastructure, marketing, and you get them all together and you do sort of a product increment type sit down across teams and say, how are we going to deliver this? Good communication, bring everybody onto the same page, and then have them go away and deliver, but continually talk. Is there any value in now or in the future potentially trying something like that? So it's still scaled. What it does is it improves your communication. It gets buy-in from people. People feel empowered because now they're taking ownership. And so it's their ideas of how they're going to deliver stuff. Descaling means you're going to find some pebbles that are not required, so they're superfluous for your MVP or however you want to define it, that you can throw away and get to at another stage. It seems to me that a lot of the benefits that you articulated, you can get via that mechanism as well, but you empower people bottom up rather than it being a top-down approach.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. In our mobile domain, they're exploring that a little bit more at the moment, actually, just in relation to the things that we're focusing on in terms of our practices, due to starting to use Monte Carlo forecasting a lot more, are more related to Kanban ways of working, and actually it suits their work quite well. I think in some of our other areas, because of how how do I put this? I think because of how we do our roadmaps and how we work with some of our stakeholders, that would be more challenging, because they are keen to understand what they are going to get when, and there is a bit more uncertainty around Kanban, I think some people feel. So don't get me wrong, I know there's lots of ways to go around that, but that would take a bit more of a mindset shift with them around that.
Yeah, and first of which is inclusion, right? So bring them in as part of that conversation and have continual conversations and inclusion all the way through. I think Absolutely. It's kind of key. But okay, no, I just thought I'd throw it out there as an idea.
I think that's the difficulty from one of the cultural things, though, actually, Mike, which is I think there's not a want to in some areas. So there is your sort of tech, you're that, I focus on this. I don't have time to be involved with all of those different things. And that's also part of the mindset shift. So I think some of our business is really open to that when working together, and some of it is less so. So that's also a key part of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it sounds as though you guys are trying a whole lot. Forecasting certainly is a paradigm shift in and of itself. You talk about probability, so it moves away from absolute deadlines and your iron triangle through to probabilistic forecasting, especially using Monte Carlo.
Yeah, it's such a game changer. It's brilliant. And I mean, it's not the silver bullet, because again, the data is only as good as what is going in. And again, with any metrics, you need to understand the context of the metrics to apply them in the right way, etc. But I agree. It's such a paradigm shift in terms of how you talk about things. And we struggled so much before being able to use that.
Well, it is. And I think, again, I don't want to monopolize, so please cut me off if I need to be cut off. But you can imagine from a customer's point of view, right? Especially customers that have invested a lot of money or something like that. They have this idea that they throw the idea down. They say, this is what we're going to achieve. Then they've got to go away, and it's blind. It's a black box to them until they get something delivered, and hopefully they get what they want. So one of the ways of trying to get around that is to say, come and speak to us. We'll include you every 2 weeks. We will agree what we're going to do with you, and then we'll keep you updated. Now, when they feel that they're empowered and invested and can actually see that you're working as hard as you are in trying to realize their goals, and they can be involved in those conversations, suddenly they become invested in the solution, and they become more forgiving when deadlines need to move, because they can understand why. And it's that, to me, that's the key component.
Can I ask a question about the whole Monte Carlo piece? How long did it take to set up? Because it's all about mathematical elements as well and things.
So we use a tool called Nave, and it integrates with Jira, and it can take all of your historical data. But for us, because we had some team changes, that wasn't totally useful. So we needed to build up we started with around a month's worth of data to be able to then be able to look at the forecasting. It can actually, so there's the ability within it to apply a scale in terms of team changes. So say if you lost someone or you've got more people, you'd be able to apply that. It was that our teams fundamentally changed, like we completely changed the composition of them. So you can take that into account within the mathematical model.
Okay, cool.
So I think there's another piece to that, which is obviously education and training. So there's always a paradigm shift, and with it comes an understanding of how to consume that new tool and the new data analytics that you get out of it. At a senior level, at a low level, everybody's consuming it and using it in a slightly different way. So you got to sort of build that into an initial adoption time.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're very much just in an experimentation phase at the moment, and we've started to use it in terms of when we're talking about our roadmap planning, when we're talking about, you know, when the horizons of when we start to see things being delivered. But like you say, that has it's taken a bit of time to be able to get the buy-in to talk about things differently, and we had the buy-in from our CTO, luckily, and that's where we've been able to make a lot of change as a result of that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Frances. I'm conscious that we are sort of starting. Sorry, I'm struggling a little bit. I can't even work out what time it is. So thank you very much. Sorry. So we probably look to wrap it up. We've had lots of really good questions, and yeah, thank you again for sharing your knowledge and for your patience with this loss of power that we're experiencing at the moment. Unless there is anything burning, just thank everybody for coming. We'd usually put a feedback form in here. I'm not able to do that at the moment. Hopefully that's obvious, but I will put it in the notes that I send out to you guys from the meetup. There's sort of an email attendees. I'll put it in there. If you do have time to do it, it literally takes 5 minutes. We'd really love to hear your feedback. I hope that you can see that we do try and get speakers from everywhere to try and fulfill your needs and wants. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So thank you ever so much. Have a wonderful rest of day, and we look forward to seeing you next time.